Thank you. Well, first I should say that I will present a balanced approach. So the context for all this, let me remind you, is merger control, like most competition policy, I think. If you look back, largely started with a focus on market share. And leaving aside for the moment the complicated problems of market definition, a focus on market share is, I think it's fair to say, motivated by the textbook undergraduate economics of marginal revenue versus price. In other words, if you have a large market share, your incentive to sell more output is softened by the fact that you'll have to lower price to do that, and you, by assumption, will have to lower price on all of your existing sales as well as the new sales. That's the motivating idea, I think it's fair to say, for being suspicious of large market share, at least from an economic point of view. So there's something a little worrying about that if you think about a more flexible contracting environment where you're not necessarily setting a single price. You might be doing price discrimination, you might be doing nonlinear pricing, you might be talking about competitive moves other than price. And so I think it's productive to rethink the concern away from what are you doing to your existing sales when you cut price in order to make more sales, and in the direction of what are the effects, what are the incentives to take business away from your rivals by offering consumers better deals. I'm not suggesting that it's a stark contrast, but it's a slightly different focus. And once you focus on the incentives to compete versus the incentives simply to cut price, I think it leads you naturally into what we also got into through another channel, which is growing dissatisfaction in the academic literature and the practitioner community. Dissatisfaction that I think is sometimes overstated with inferences about market power based on concentration and market share. And you'll probably remember from your education, if not from living it, that in the 1970s, particularly, the economics literature increasingly was disappointed at its ability to find clear relationships there. I think there are some statistical and measurement issues that may help to explain that, and that's part of why I say that the disappointment is sometimes overstated, but nevertheless the disappointment was there. And so the time was ripe in some sense for the introduction of techniques that relied more closely on fundamental logic of competition rather than the fundamental logic of monopoly pricing, and that reflected a kind of direct scientific approach rather than a general catch-all through market share approach, even though there can be something beneficially robust about focusing on size and capabilities rather than on direct and detailed analysis, and I may come back to that a little later. How do I control the slides? Here? Okay. So I'm going to talk about three flavors of this, what I would call a direct evaluation of how competitive incentives change with a merger in a unilateral way. And I actually don't remember what order I put them on the slides, but the order they are on this slide is IPR, that stands not for intellectual property rights, as some of you might be thinking, but for illustrative price rises, merger simulation, and upward pricing pressure. And as I just foreshadowed, I'd also like to say a little bit about what products to focus on and how. And why it says agenda item 3, I don't know, but maybe there will be one. Okay, so starting with merger simulation. So You've probably seen, some of you have certainly done, merger simulations. A merger simulation is a very ambitious thing to do. Okay? It's ambitious in a couple of senses. One is that it takes on the task of modeling the industry pre-merger and then modeling it again post-merger. And you might think, well, isn't that inherent in merger evaluation? And my answer is no. So please watch. You probably don't know how much water was in the bottle before I poured, and you don't know how much water is in the bottle after I poured, but you know there's less. You can beneficially focus on the change in some circumstances without having very much to say about the level, either pre or post. And it turns out, I think, that that's very important in doing analysis of especially unilateral effects from a merger. It's often easier and more reliable to gauge something about the change in incentives than it is to model all of the complicated incentives that are likely to be present in a real-world industry. Merger simulation fights against that by trying to model the levels, and that's a big ask. So merger simulation in practice usually assumes a static, imperfectly competitive equilibrium, usually assumes constant marginal costs, usually assumes a particular functional form for demand, and then takes econometric data, or takes data and uses econometric techniques to estimate the parameters, both the demand parameters and the supply parameters for the industry. In particular, it usually needs lots of demand data, and usually needs to assume or find clever ways to avoid strictly assuming that the demand data are in response to quasi-exogenous price changes. I won't try to do a full discussion of the econometric issues, but one thing to point out is the more data you use, the more you're forced either to go into the distant past, and depending on the market, the distant past may not be all that distant, or to use short-run data. And when we're doing merger evaluation, of course, we care about long-term or medium-term demand responses much more than we care about short-term demand responses. And in some circumstances, those can be rather different creatures. Okay? So by pursuing a technique that requires a lot of data in order to estimate a lot of parameters, you're getting yourself into a data supply problem, which might take the form either of not being able to find the data or of having to use data on an uncomfortably short response cycle or going back uncomfortably far into the past. Okay? So in return for these bargains with the devil, merger simulation gets what you might be inclined to view as the holy grail of merger evaluation. It gets a prediction of the price effects of the merger. Okay? As I'll explain in a minute, I think these price predictions should not be too literally interpreted, and I think they sometimes are too literally interpreted. And the way that the economics literature has made this point most specifically is in the following observation, that even conditional on all of the first order effects, that is the elasticities and cross-elasticities and the marginal costs, the prediction of merger simulation or the result of a merger in a static, imperfectly competitive equilibrium depends very sensitively on not just the first order aspects, the elasticities, but also the curvature and generally the functional form of the demand system. Okay, and to me, that fact is quite important in thinking about how much value to get out of a merger simulation exercise. There we go. Illustrative price rises try to deal with this in a way that to experts I think is perfectly sound, but is subject to some misinterpretation. So the IPR approach is to refrain from trying to guess or estimate what the demand system is, but rather to assume a particular simple functional form and to be conscious that you haven't got the functional form right. Okay? Now you might say, isn't that just being sure you've made an error rather than risking making an error? Well, sort of, but it has the great psychological and expositional value that means you're aware of it. Okay? So in practice, I mean, I won't spend much time on this. Usually, I think IPR uses either linear or log linear, that is to say constant elasticity demand systems. Dan Rubenfeld has suggested that you can beneficially use PC-AIDS. It seems to me that, and you'll see why in a minute, that the key point is you systematically use the same one and you don't pretend to yourself that you've got it right. Okay? IPR often simplifies in other ways. Sometimes we'll consciously ignore feedback effects and so on. But the key point about it is that unlike an unguarded interpretation of a merger simulation, it's consciously interpreted, I think it's fair to say, certainly should be, as indicative or illustrative, as probably better at comparing the competitive concerns of this merger versus that than of truly predicting the price effects of either. Sometimes people will interpret the log linear version as an upper bound because among commonly used demand systems, log linear tends to have rather strong price effects. But basically, I think the point is it's an expositional technique in which you come out with something that looks like a price prediction, but with luck will not be interpreted as a price prediction. Upward pricing pressure. So unlike both IPR and merger simulation, UPP is in my view, relatively simple technique, and its simplicity starts by being focused on the change in incentives due to the merger, with no necessary attempt being made to model the level. Okay? And that's valuable if, for example, in this industry, there are follow-on sales, there are valuable customer relationships, there are network effects, there's learning by doing. All of these things create a shadow value for the firms of additional sales that is going to be very difficult for an outsider or perhaps even an insider to model, but that doesn't have to get in the way of understanding and even calibrating the change in incentives. So what is UPP? It's a very simple idea. So before the merger, when firm A contemplates any pro-competitive move that might be cutting some prices, it might be improving customer service, it might be introducing a new product, any of those moves benefits consumers and might be profitable for the firm, partly by taking business away from firm B. Okay? And what changes with the merger, conditional on set of products or something like that, is that cannibalization effect is internalized, whereas before it was ignored. And that's the change in incentives due to the merger. UPP is really the observation that that's going to be treated by rational profit-maximizing firms as the equivalent of any other new cost incurred by this pro-competitive move. Okay? And you can formulate it in terms of a cost per unit sold by describing the impact on the partner firm as the diversion ratio, which is related to the ratio of elasticities, but if you understand that comment, you don't need me to make it, times the margin being earned at the rival firm. But it's a flexible insight, and so if you have non-static competition, for example, you can do your best to trace through, all right, what is the overall cannibalization effect of this new product introduction on that firm that we're thinking of merging with. So you can use the basic idea rather flexibly. You can even use it for vertical transactions by thinking, instead of cannibalizing business, of steering more business to your merging partner. That's essentially like a negative diversion ratio, and the same logic can apply. Okay? So unlike IPR and merger simulation, UPP is a calculation done in cost space, not in price space. Okay? One advantage of that is it makes it easier to compare the market power effect or the change in incentives against marginal cost efficiencies. But, well, let me just leave it that. I think the reason that I like it, frankly, is it's often, I think, the robust part of merger simulation. And let me explain what I mean by that. Merger simulation, intuitively, and as I'll explain in a minute, more than intuitively, can be viewed as calculation of upward pricing pressure, and then figuring out how in an assumed industry structure, with an assumed demand structure, that cost change is going to be passed through by the industry into price changes. And one of the things we know from oligopoly theory and even just the theory of monopoly is that pass-through of cost changes is somewhat unpredictable, depends delicately on the demand system, and is very hard to predict econometrically. So it seems to me that the part of the merger simulation, once you've had that insight, the part of the merger simulation that is directly related to the competitive incentives is roughly the UPP part, I would say perhaps even precisely the UPP part. And then merger simulation takes that and attempts to calculate the pass-through of that into prices. And that latter task, I think, is an order of magnitude more difficult, basically for the reasons that I explained earlier. So all of this stuff is what leads me, in my balanced view, to feel that upward pricing pressure is probably a better technique in most cases than merger simulation. So since it operates in cost space and not price space, we're less accustomed to intuiting what might be a tolerable or intolerable level for it. Some people have suggested thresholds for upward pricing pressure. I try not to go there because it seems to me it's important to weigh all the evidence, and if you start talking about thresholds for one particular indicator, you tend to gravitate towards a single factor analysis, and I don't think that's a very good thing to do. A couple of updates, and I think I'm running a little short on time, so I'll try to go fast. Sonia Jaffe and Glenn Weil have shown how to rigorously extend the UPP logic to non-static conduct and to refine the understanding of the pass-through rate. They identify something that they call the merger pass-through rate that is conceptually slightly different from the pre-merger and post-merger cost pass-through rates for the industry, but they argue that it's likely to not be very different in normal cases. Nate Miller, formerly at the Justice Department, now at Georgetown, and his co-authors do some simulations, and they compare essentially the UPP technique, although they call it linear approximation, with potentially right but potentially wrong demand system simulations. I think it's fair to say that mostly what they call linear approximation fares rather well, and perhaps more surprisingly, merger pass-through is in many cases not so different from pre-merger pass-through, which suggests that you can at least try to gauge things that way. Finally, the politics. Have things calmed down? I have to say, probably I shouldn't have been, but I was taken a little by surprise at the alarm with which serious discussion of these methods was greeted in especially US competition policy circles a few years ago. A number of people seemed sort of unhappy about the idea that agencies would be paying attention to modern methods for evaluating unilateral effects, and expressed some nostalgia for the concentration-based approaches that had been somewhat moved away from. So what's going on there? I don't know what's going on there. I think some people perhaps, well, let me leave it at that. I don't know what's going on there. But I would point out that there is a political economy aspect to this. So if we treat it as given that for partly good reasons, partly perhaps overstated reasons, we are going to rely less on concentration-based indicators, in some sense the big question is there something else that you start to rely on more? Or do you just say, we'll never know what the effect of a merger is likely to be? And that latter position has a political consequence, which is, in most merger control regimes, it's going to be very hard to block any mergers. Okay? And so I think as we think about evaluating these more modern techniques, we need to remember that there is a bit of a vacuum created by the retreat of the concentration-based approaches. And that vacuum can either be filled or not, and either of those possibilities has its consequences. I think that's it. Yep. Thank you.